I'm really happy to be able to present this software for you today. I'm going to go through a quick presentation and then we'll switch over to a live demo of the software. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please type them in and Alfred will collect those questions and read them to me at certain breaks throughout the session. Okay. We're scheduled to go just about an hour this morning, so that's what we should plan on. I may go a little bit longer to answer any questions at the end that you might have. In order to design this new product for HDR Expose 3, we looked at the challenges that photographers had with the HDR workflow, and we wanted to create specific new features and functionality that address these specific challenges. So some of the most prominent challenges that we identified were being able to manage multiple files. Obviously, for HDR capture, you have to capture large exposure brackets that doubles, triples, quadruples, even higher your frame, the number of frames that you bring back. So managing these exposure brackets was always a challenge for a lot of people. So we've created a new file browser that helps to simplify that task. We also wanted to look at the types of photos that you could take with HDR. And you were typically limited to very static scenes. You couldn't have people or objects moving through the scenes because they created ghost artifacts. So we totally rewrote our deghosting algorithms for the software. You're also really forced into a static camera workflow where you would have to set out for an HDR excursion. You'd bring a tripod and everything else to set your camera up to make sure that nothing moved. You'll still get the best results if you work with a static camera, but it would also limit your spontaneity if you're out and walking around and then you come across a high contrast scene that you're not able to capture with a single exposure. You can now do an exposure series and process that as an HDR because our new alignment algorithms will address the camera movement. But probably the number one issue that a lot of folks had troubles with was being able to tone map the images, especially when you have very wide dynamic range scenes, trying to balance the highlight detail and the shadow contrast in a single pass. So we've created brand new adaptive tone mapping algorithms to address this issue. So I'm going to go through a couple examples of this, and then we'll obviously show this also in the live demo. This is a screenshot of our new visual browser. Now, instead of looking at file names, and especially if you're working with files directly from the camera that have just a strange numbering scheme, you now see the actual thumbnails of the images that you're going to merge. And we also have a new auto stacking feature that automatically groups those exposure brackets together and makes it much more easy to identify the bracket that you want to work with and select the images to merge. Ghost removal is something anytime you have objects moving between frames in an image in a bracketed exposure series and you try to merge them, you'll wind up with ghost artifacts. That looks something like this, where you see a person is half in this person is moving, you see him half in the screen, kind of an outline, and you can see through them. That's the ghost artifact. Now with our new deghosting tools, we're actually able to isolate these individual moving objects or people in a scene. Again, this opens up a lot more possibilities for HDR scenes that you would usually try to steer clear of previously. Auto alignment is a new feature in the software. This is an example of an image that was shot freehand without a tripod. I was just walking around here and wanted to capture an HDR shot here, so I did this freehand. We have new automatic alignment tools, and for those images that are really far out of alignment, where the automatic tools can't is unable to get the perfect alignment, we have new manual tools that allow you to fine tweak and manually align parts of the images. Halo elimination has been something that we've had several revisions now. Again, this will remove the telltale halo artifacts that you have at high contrast transitions. that have sort of been the signature look of uh, HDR processing in previous years. Our software is based on human vision and the way our eyes perceive color and dynamic range. We have very good HDR sensors with our visual system, and we don't see halos when we look at something like this. So the software shouldn't produce halos either. Veil and glare correction has been a tool that we've had since our first products. It was in previous releases a bit of a challenge to use because it required a mode change into a different color space and a different way of viewing the image. We've rewritten those algorithms as well, so now you can apply veiling glare to any image, veiling glare correction to any image without having to make this mode change. So you're able to get really great results from very high dynamic range scenes. For example, this shot here has over 15 stops of dynamic range. All of our processing is done on the full 32-bit image data. So when we merge the images together, we create a 32-bit HDR file that covers the entire dynamic range of all of the exposure brackets. And then we process we process the image with the full 32-bit data precision. So here you're able to see you can render subtle details in the snow patch out here outside the window, as well as mid-tone areas here inside the shack and even down into the shadow areas, floorboards. The tone mapping is, like I said, one of the biggest challenges that we addressed. So when we do tone mapping, we're actually compressing your your tonal range in order to take an image that has a much larger range that could be shown on a computer screen and compressing it down into roughly in an 8 stop range. When we did this before, we ran into issues of highlight compression in very wide dynamic range scenes. You can see that here on this particular shot. This is the exposure difference in this scene. This is over 16 stops of dynamic range. You can see the shadow detail here in this treatment. Now the highlight detail is out here in this treatment. So this is all from the same image. It's just looking at the shadow areas versus the highlight areas. So the trick is then to tone map this to make sure that it all comes together. So if we look at the histogram of this image, you see a couple of peaks here. This top peak represents the shadow areas here inside the tunnel. And this other peak here represents sort of the highlight detail outside this arch. So we would tone map this previously and compress the zone down to just 8 stops in order to be able to have an image that can display fully on your computer screen, which would result in this curve that has compressed highlight detail. So you can see here in this rendition that the highlight detail here is washed out. You can hardly make out the contrast in the bricks. The sky has kind of a weird light blue color. So you could either expose for the shadows, or you could expose or process for the highlights. If you process for the highlights, you would get this more natural looking rendition outside. But when you do that, you would lose the shadow information. So you would, for these kinds of critical images, you typically then perhaps do 2 passes, process once for the shadows and once for the highlights. We wanted to improve on that, so that's where our new adaptive tone mapping concept came in. I have the same initial starting curve here, and now I'm creating a custom adaptive tone curve for this image. So every image has a custom adaptive tone curve calculated for it. And you can see, instead of using just a linear transition, we're manipulating the curve here to enhance the contrast for the different ranges of the images to different amounts. So now I wind up with a histogram that looks like this. That's a little more evenly distributed. Now, this is the technology that we introduced with HDR Express 2 last year. What we've done now is added another control feature in HDR Expose 3, which is called the gamma control, or it's actually brightness adaptation. And with this control, we're going to be adjusting that curve. And I want to show you how the effect that this slider has, because it's a very critical component of the new process. So if I look at those adaptive tone curves that we calculated, the default curve is this green one here. As I would adjust the gamma slider above the default value of 50, I'm increasing this curve, which creates this representation. If I go below 50, I'm decreasing that. So the effect that it has is that it's going to open your shadows and your midtones, and the highlight values will remain fixed. So you can use the gamma adjustment to brighten or darken the images globally, and it's a different effect than adjusting the the exposure slider. The exposure slider will move everything up or down. So the gamma control, the gamma slider, adjusts basically the angle of these curves. So let me look at what the histogram looks like now for this image. If for the low histogram would look like this, the histogram for the medium gamma would look like this, and the high gamma would look like this. If I go back again, you can see we're doing a nice job maintaining the overall contrast of the image without overly compressing the highlights. So that will give us a result that looks like this, which is much more balanced right off the bat, and a great starting point then for further changes that you might want to make. So that's the adaptive tone mapping algorithms. It's the end of the PowerPoint session, so I'm going to now go into a live demo of the software. So let's just launch right into to the software. We're going to start off creating a new HDR image. So I'll click on the Create Merge New HDR Image button. And when I do that, now you see my visual browser comes up. I'm going to change over to another folder. So I click the Choose button, go back to my desktop, and I'll take this folder. So you see when I click on the folder now, this is an important thing I want to point out. All your file names show up here, but they're grayed out, and that's because we're not opening an individual file. You'll see it says up here, Open Directory. So we want to select this folder to open. These images are grayed out, but we're opening the folder, not the individual images. So when I click on Choose here, it now loads these images as bracketed exposures into my window here. We have the auto stack images slider here. So you can see as I scroll down here that these images all belong to the same bracket. I can adjust the auto stacking slider to the point where they all show up on the same line. So this particular scene has 11 images in it. This one has 12 images in it. I have some with 3 or 4. You can bracket as many images as you want. The key thing is that you have at least one image that captures all your highlight information and another image that captures all your shadow information. So as you go through when you're on location and you're shooting, you really want to pay attention to your histogram to make sure that out of all of your exposure brackets that you at least have one that doesn't have blinking highlights, or if you look at the histogram that doesn't clip the highlights. If you clip the highlights when you capture the images, you're never going to be able to recover them. So that's a very important thing to pay attention to. I'm going to start off with this scene here. This is a scene that I shot on a beach in Monterey, California a while ago. You'll notice that you have, when you select these are 5 images in this bracket. They'll show up here in the list. You'll see the exposure settings here, and there's one image that is designated as the keyframe. We automatically calculate the keyframe. This is usually around the 0 EV or your middle exposure value. and you can go in and select other ones if you want to. And I'll show you how to do that in a moment. But let's just start with this selection. So now the software is automatically aligning these images and doing the automatic ghost removal. So as I look at this scene, this is a shot and it has a lot of people along the beach, and they're obviously all alive and they're all moving. So the software has, and even the seagull here is obviously also alive and moving. The software has automatically isolated the moving objects and handled the ghosting. And if you think of a lot of the cityscape type of photography that a lot of people do, anywhere you go that's interesting, you usually have people there, and the people really make the scene. Having just an empty beach here is probably not as interesting. So this deghosting, this automatic deghosting feature is very powerful. Let me go in and show you how you can adjust this and how the different parameters and settings work. I'm going to close this out and then I'll go back in again. I'm going to select these again, and I can go into my manual settings, and then I'll preview this image. So this is an extra step if you want to see what effect a different keyframe might have. So if I select a different keyframe, I can see people in different positions, and I can use this to choose which image I want to use as the keyframe. Now, you'll get better results if you have keyframes that are at the zero EV or the medium exposure or darker. And the reason for that is that you have more data points in that image that you can use to align to. If I go up to the overexposed frame, you can see that this is very bright. So a lot of your area is overexposed here, so you're not able to find those reference points. And you can see some ghost artifacts coming in here now if you look at the people moving across the frame. You can also adjust the sensitivity of this slider. The keyframe tuning slider determines how dominant the keyframe is in managing the scene. I'll click on the Merge Static Photos checkbox here, and that sets my keyframe tuning to 0. So basically, I'm taking just the optimal exposure from each one of the frames, and I'm merging that to give me the smoothest possible tonal transition and the best signal to noise ratio. I do this if I'm working on static scenes like interior architecture shots where camera is fixed on a tripod and there's nothing moving. When there are things moving in this, you can see how the ghost elements start to come through in this area here. So for this scene, I would turn that off and just go with the default value for the keyframe tuning here. So that's how the keyframe issue works. I'm going to look at a different image that has a lot of shadow detail. So I'm going to want to use the merge static photo option on it. And it's almost completely static. This was taken, camera was mounted on a tripod. I used a cable release. And there is one element moving in this case. That is the flag on the flag post that's kind of waving in the wind. So if I zoom in on this image now, you can see that the shadows are very clean. The alignment is good. Again, shot on a tripod. The only issue here is the flag that shows these ghost artifacts. So everything else in the scene was still, just this was moving. I have a manual manual deghosting tool that I can use to address the moving flag. Find this again. So I'm going to click on manual. I have my merge static photos option checked. Click on preview. And then I have my deghosting tool here. I can draw this over the flag. And right now I'm using the 0 EV frame as my keyframe. And when I do that, the this tool is telling the software to take the area that's inside this circle here and now apply the part of the image that comes from the 0 EV keyframe to this part of the image. So I get the benefit of the of all the clean shadow areas using the keyframe tuning set to 0. And I'm also able to remove the ghost image around the flag. Now, if I had people walking around on top here or additional moving objects in this frame, I can add multiple manual deghosting spots to a single image. You can have multiple areas, not just one. But in this case, that's the only thing that's moving in this image. So if I do a merge now, it's going to go through and correct this. With the beach shot, I had just too much movement with the waves and with all the people moving. So in that case, I decided to go with a keyframe selection and the stronger keyframe tuning value. So that's manual and automatic deghosting. Let's look at another image now. Like I said, a lot of times if you're out walking around with a camera, you might not be carrying a tripod with you, and you want to take an HDR bracket, and you can do that, and then use the automatic alignment and manual alignment tools to recover from any camera movement. So obviously here you can see that there's quite a bit of camera movement here. Even with this shot, I mean, you need to stand in one location. You can't take an exposure bracket from a moving car. You want to be standing in one location. And I was leaning against the lamp pole and trying to hold the camera as still as possible. I guess I must have had a cup of coffee before I did this, so there's some jitter there. Now there's a couple different ways that I can handle this. If I select the keyframe and have my stronger keyframe tuning, so right now I'm selecting the 0 EV spot, I can use this to automatically align. And this is actually what the software will do by default if you just go straight to the through the automatic mode. But let's go back and dial this back in, and I'll show you how we can do some of the manual alignment if I want to. So I'll click on the manual alignment tool, which is this little crosshair icon here. I'm going to go up and select an area that's common to all the images. So maybe the top here, the inside peak of this little detail. And then I'll select another area, maybe here on the roof ridge. Now, you need to have at least 3 manual points in the image, obviously, to get some initial alignment. And you can have up to 8 points in an image. And the more alignment points, like I said, up to 8, and the more spread out they are in the image, the better job it'll do manually aligning them. So if I just click on apply now, you can see that that's brought this back into alignment. I'm not going to go through the effort right now to do multiple additional spots. I just wanted to show you how this tool works. So basically, you want to start off with the automatic tools. Obviously, if you're able to address this with the automatic tools, you're done. It's a lot easier. If you have a really tricky scene where you need the manual override, then you have the option here to do the manual alignment as well. Now, I just want to close on the alignment and the deghosting with one example here, and this is a very tricky shot, one that I took several years ago when I was on vacation with the family in Philadelphia. I was walking around Independence Square. Again, didn't have a tripod and wanted to shoot this scene. And I took it with the expectation that at some point in the future, we'd have functionality like this where we could create an HDR image, a good HDR image from this scene. So here I have the worst of both worlds. I have uh, camera movement because I didn't have a tripod, and I also had a lot of people moving through the scene here. So we're able to do the automatic alignment here, especially noticeable around all the detail here and the brickwork in the building. And you have trees, if there's a breeze, you'll have movement in the foliage, and obviously live people, not mannequins, walking through the scene, which is the tourist attraction. You would expect to see people there. So this is all done automatically. Just load it up and run it through. So that's some of the strong features of HDR Expose 3, the new manual and automatic alignment and deghosting algorithms.